Well, good afternoon, fellow DIY friends. This is DIY Dave here. We're going to undertake a new project today. We're back out in the garage. Today we're going to take a look at some transmission service on a 2008 Toyota Sienna. This is a car that we've had since it was brand new. It's been a great performer, but the time has come to refresh the transmission fluid. So join us for a little exploration of the arguments around transmission maintenance and how we're going to do it on our van, and you can decide if it's appropriate for your situation. Thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoy the video. Okay, so what are we going to do? Transmission maintenance is probably one of the most hotly debated topics in automotive circles. Newer cars these days have what they call permanently sealed transmissions that have, quote, lifetime fluid in them. And I'm not one of the people who believes in the idea of lifetime fluid. You don't have to be a chemical or science whiz to know that heat and contamination over time will break down almost any automotive lubricant. That's why you have to replace it. And transmission fluid is no exception. And one of the motivations, I think, behind the concept of lifetime transmission fluid is to get to a point where, well, if you really have to flush that transmission fluid out of there, bring it back to our dealership and we will flush it for you in an approved way, with an approved system. And what that basically means is they hook up a machine, they take the transmission coolant lines that run in and out of the transmission up to a machine, and they force a cleaning solution through the transmission the opposite direction with a cleaning agent that forces all that stuff out so they can replace it with full fresh fluid. Now, on the surface, that seems perfectly sensible. So what's wrong with that? Well, a couple of things. Number one, the fluid flush machines that most shops and dealerships use, and I won't say all of them because I don't know about all of them, are designed to take their fluid cleaning mixture and force it through the transmission in a direction hydraulically that is 180 degrees opposite the flow that the transmission normally undertakes when it's in normal operation. It's an oversimplification to illustrate it this way, but it tries to illustrate the point by saying that if the normal flow of fluid in a transmission is one direction, the fluid machine forces it the other direction. Well, that should just seem, as a matter of common sense, a wrong thing to do, because you have myriad gears and valves and switches and components and galleries inside a transmission, which is a mechanically extremely complex mechanism, that when you start forcing fluid to go in a direction it wasn't designed to go, I think you risk inducing damage to those components. A transmission is one of the most complicated pieces of machinery inside any vehicle, and if you start going against the way it's supposed to work, I think you're asking for trouble. That's my personal opinion. Also, part of the reason I don't like flushes is because as a natural consequence of any transmission, you're going to, over time, get little filaments of metal that come off of the transmission as a normal piece of wear and tear. You mix that in with that fluid, and in the course of the transmission's operation, that sediment will either float or settle in the bottom of the transmission pan, or it will be caught by the magnets that are in the bottom of the drain pan, or it will be shoved into the galleries and recesses of the transmission such that you never notice it and it doesn't interfere with the proper operation of the transmission. Unless you hook up a flush machine that forces that fluid the wrong direction and then takes some of those particulate pieces of metal and start shoving them in places they weren't supposed to go. That can induce strange transmission behavior that wasn't there before, slippage, bad behavior, just strange performance that just wasn't there before. So as a result, I just don't believe in transmission flushes. I just don't. Now, there's a school of thought that if you do let a transmission go too far without changing the transmission, you're probably better off leaving it alone and not changing it at all. And there's some merit to that. I think Chris Fix has done a video where he illustrates that point where if it's too far gone, maybe you're better off not trying to change it. I'm kind of in the middle of that right now. Most of the research I've done in our 2008 Toyota Sienna is that the transmission and the engine combination in this particular van are rock solid. That you can, as a matter of experience, go about 100,000 miles before you need to start thinking about changing it. Well, we're past that. And I am at that sweet spot where you could make an argument that it might be just as well to leave it alone. After all due consideration and considering how we drive this van, I'm going to go ahead and engage in the process of trying to replace replace our transmission fluid. So how are we going to do it? So here's what we're going to do. I'm not going to flush it. I'm going to engage in what's basically called a spill and fill. I'm going to do a repeated spill and fill. If you take the bolt off of the transmission drain pan and drain the fluid that's in the transmission pan, you're going to get about 4 quarts. Now, that doesn't get all of the fluid, which makes it different from like changing the engine oil. If you change the engine oil and drain it, you're going to get about 95% of the old oil out of there, give or take. But when you change transmission fluid, you drain out the transmission, you're only going to get what's in the pan, and that's about 4 to 4.5 quarts, give or take. There's a mechanism inside a transmission called a torque converter, and it essentially sequesters somewhere between 8 to 10 additional quarts of fluid that don't come out when you take out the transmission pan drain bolt. So what does that mean? If I drain and refill about 4 quarts out of a system that holds somewhere between 12 to 14 quarts, I'm only replacing about 1/3 of that fluid with fresh fluid. So does it really do me any good to have 1/3 new with 2/3 old? Well, some, but I would rather go farther than that. I would rather get much over half of that old fluid replaced. And what we can do is by doing this over a period of repeated cycles. If I replace about 1/3, leaving 2/3 behind, I can then wait about 250 to 300 miles after I make that first change and repeat the process. I'll take that 2/3 that I left behind and only leave 1/3 of it behind by replacing it again. That second time I have now left only 4/9. You do a little bit of math. I've only left about 4/9 of that original oil behind, meaning I am now about 55% replaced. If I do it a third time, I now reach about 70% replacement, and that is about a sweet spot. If I engage in a 4th or 5th repetition, I'm not nearly getting as much marginal benefit out of those replacements, getting up to around the 90% mark if I do it up to, I think, 6 times. I've actually done the math on it, and for me, the decision I've made is that I'm going to go through this process 3 times. I'm going to drain and fill, replacing 1/3 of the fluid each time, and then wait about 250 to 500 miles to allow the normal fluid mechanics processes in the transmission to take the old oil, mix it, or the old transmission fluid in the torque converter, mix it in with the new that I'm going to replace it with, and then when I replace it in 500 miles, I'll be replacing a mixture of the old and the new, and then I'll put up a little graphic that shows the math a little bit more specifically. Now, a lot of times, in most cases, when you update a transmission like this, or when you service a transmission, there's the consideration of a transmission filter. Just like an oil filter, you have a transmission filter that catches some of the particulates that come through the transmission as a matter of its normal operation. In this particular case, on this particular Sienna that we have here, the filter is a very broad metal mesh. It is not a fine particulate filter in the same vein that you might look if you cut open an oil filter and looked at the paper filter media, which gets very small particles loose. The mesh filter in this particular transmission is much broader, and based on that, and also some concurring commentary I've read from some other mechanics, suggests that you can replace the filter if you want. There's certainly no harm in doing that, but it's not critical. And also, to replace the filter requires you to remove the drain pan, the transmission drain pan itself, and replacing that entails a very specific effort about replacing a gasket and a proper application of torque among all the bolts to make sure that you don't develop a leak. And it's frankly, for the amount of return in the investment and the effort for replacing the filter, necessitating dropping the transmission pan and putting in a new gasket and making sure you restore the proper torque to the right bolts in the proper order and don't distort the pan and induce a leak at the pan gasket itself, I've decided I'm not going to mess with it. I'm just going to do a straight spill and fill. So, what do we need for this? Let's take a break and I'll show you what we need. So with all that said, what are we going to need to do the transmission drain or fill and spill, as it's sometimes called? First thing we're going to need to remove the drain bolt from the transmission pan is a 10mm hex head socket, preferably one that you can mount on either a 3/8 or a 1/2" drive so you can put it on a torque wrench. You will need a torque wrench to put the bolt back in once we've refilled the transmission, once we've drained the transmission. You've got to torque it back to 36 foot-pounds to ensure it doesn't leak. You'll also need a set of what they call crush washers. It's a metal washer that goes on the bolt when you replace it that essentially serves as a gasket to prevent the transmission from leaking once you reseal it, and it does have a torque spec that I think is probably pretty important to follow to avoid leaks. Other than that, we're going to put the Toyota on and we're also going to need about 4 quarts of transmission fluid. The 2008 Toyota Sienna requires Type IV fluid, not the quote world standard fluid that has been more prevalent in their later year transmissions. Yes, there are third-party manufacturers that produce a Type IV compatible fluid. It's probably okay to use for a transmission like that, and I know Toyota doesn't make the fluid. I feel better using their named OEM fluid. Probably not necessary, but that's what I want to use. Beyond that, we're going to put the Sienna on ramps. We're going to crawl under there, drain out the fluid. We're also going to use a graduated container like this milk bottle. It's going to be really important to know how much we drain out of the transmission because we want to replace it with just that much fluid. Let me get that on camera. It's going to be really important to make sure that whatever we take out of the transmission, we put right back in the exact same amount, so we don't have to worry about overfilling or underfilling the transmission once we're done. And this is just nothing but a milk bottle that I have taken and incrementally filled in 2-cup increments and put a piece of tape on here to show where the fill levels are. I'm expecting to get about 4 quarts out of the transmission. My Haynes manual says that a drain and refill on a transmission of this particular model should give me about 3.5 quarts, maybe more. So we'll see. About a gallon is what I'm thinking we're going to end up getting. Also, for a matter of convenience, I'm going to have one of these long funnels that just fits into the really narrow ends of the dipstick holder. That's the refill port for the transmission. They're easier to handle than the larger funnel that I have that I use primarily for oil changes. The Type IV fluid from Toyota comes in these 6-pack containers, and I was very surprised to find that the local Toyota dealer had them for a little over $6 a quart, which was roughly equal to the best price I saw on Amazon. As far as those crush washers go, the model number 9430-18008, they come in a variety of packages. You can get them at the local Toyota dealer. They vary greatly in how much. Some places charge $3 or $4 a washer. And these are just a package of washers. You can get a package of 10 of them online. I saw them for as cheap as $3 to $10, depending on where you get them. Sometimes they'll run a special on them for some reason. This particular set came in a package that's intended for a differential service kit. Now, I'm not servicing a differential, but it had the exact same washers, the 18008 washers. And since I'm going to be doing this 3 times over the next few weeks, and this kit comes with, I think, 8 washers. This suits the bill, and I think it was $3.28 from some site on Amazon. Anyway, the dealership and most chain garages, for a flush and refill to recycle, supposedly 100% of your fluid, are going to probably charge a price of somewhere between, I would guess, $250 to $400. I know that when we took this Sienna in for a warranty recall a few months ago, they told us that we needed to replace the fluid and they would be more than happy to do a flush and refill service for us, and I believe the quote was about $400, which I summarily said thanks but no thanks and moved on. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to put the Sienna on ramps. We're going to chock the back wheels, set the parking brake. All the standard safety measures apply. One thing to do, it's important to remember that before we drain the fluid out of the transmission, it's important to run the car because the fluid drains best when it is hot. Now, the downside of that is that transmission fluid gets really hot and it is a serious burn risk. So I'm going to be putting on some gloves to protect myself, and I'll be draining the fluid into a pan, and then the catch pan I'll pour into my measuring jug to see how much we're getting back out. So we'll go ahead and get the Sienna started up and let it run, let it warm up, and then we'll set out to get it drained and refilled. That process shouldn't take very long, so we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so we've got the Sienna on our ramps, and as always, we're gonna chock the wheels. And we are gonna set our parking brake. There. Safety always, right? Or safety at least third, as Eric O would say, of South Main Auto. Okay, once again, we need our graduated jug. We have the funnel. We have at least 4 quarts of Type IV automatic transmission fluid. I've also picked up a spill mat, and I've also picked up a 10mm hex head socket to remove the transmission pan drain bolt. So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, we are now underneath the Sienna. We put out a little oil mat that I picked up for about $10 over at Walmart. That's a 10-quart drain pan that we're going to use. Dandy, again, also at Walmart. Opened up the little vent hood so it will take in the oil as fast as we can drain it out. And as we'll get a little closer here, if the camera can adjust, there we go. There is the drain bolt that goes in the bottom of the transmission pan. Now let's make absolutely sure that we don't confuse this with the oil change pan. The oil pan is over here with the with a little hex bolt that we've been before, and there's the oil filter mechanism. We're not dealing with any of that. We're over here dealing with the transmission pan. That is a 10mm star socket, and we're going to loosen that and then retighten it with a fresh crush washer to 36 foot-pounds once we're done. So let's go ahead and get that going. Now, I am filming all of this myself today. I don't have the benefit of a cameraman, so please forgive me if sometimes it gets a little bit out of whack. I will try my best to keep focused on the task at hand, and that is on super tight. I'm right-handed, so let me switch hands and see if I can get a little bit better grip on it. Nope, I'm going to have to get my helper, my breaker bar. Alright, now we have the breaker bar. I've got about 18 inches of leverage here. Let's see if we can go ahead and pull this guy loose. Ah, perfect. No problem at all. Ooh, there it comes. Oh boy, it's making a mess. Woo, doggies. A few observations, just what I've been cleaning up. Once the transmission drain bolt was out, the fluid came out much more rapidly than I expected. I think I was naively expecting a flow roughly equivalent to when I changed the oil. This was much more forceful and a much greater quantity. In fact, it spilled out beyond my drain pan or my collection pan and even the oil mat I put out, and it spilled a bunch. So I'm going to have to take that into account when I measure how much we've drained out. Live and learn. It's a bit of a mess. Fortunately, 2 words: shop towels. So as soon as this stops dripping, and it looks like it's just about done, we'll put the new crush washer and the drain bolt back on, and then we'll refill it, and we're essentially done. Now, while that's finishing draining out, we can take a look at the drain plug bolt and then the crush washer. This small ring right here is the crush washer that we're going to replace. Notice that it's not perfectly fit, it's slightly deformed, and that's part of the purpose to help it retain seal once it's put back in. So we're going to go ahead and replace that. We have removed the crush washer, and interestingly enough, that was a lot more difficult than I expected. It's very snug, and what I ended up doing was very carefully taking a flat blade screwdriver and wedging in underneath and carefully prying up the washer, careful not to score the bolt, because that would be a terrible location to get a leak. So what I'm going to do now is that we have it off. I used a pair of pliers to hold it and just basically spin it off. It finally came off. We'll just replace it with the new one and seal it back up. Okay, so here's our package. Again, I got this particular washer, this 18008 part number, Toyota OEM part number, as part of a package of washers that came in a differential kit. And it listed these among the part numbers. And I think it's pretty obvious that I was able to find the match for this guy. Exact same diameter, exact same fit. So here's the replacement. I'll just go ahead and put that on the plug, which I have right here. There, nice and snug. We'll just go ahead and put that back in. Now we're down to a slow drip here, and that is more than adequate for our purposes. We have no intention of getting the entirety. We know we're not going to get the entirety of fluid out of here. So we're going to wash that down, and we're going to put this back in here to hand tight, and then we will use a torque wrench to get it back up to 36 foot-pounds. Now, when I start a thread like this, I will typically do it counterclockwise to feel it sit, and then I will rotate it back into place to avoid cross-threading it. And of course, I didn't put my gloves back on. Oh well. Okay, so that gets me to hand tight, and now we'll get our torque wrench and tighten it up. Okay, we have the torque wrench here, and just as a little refresher, we keep the torque wrench loose. We don't want to keep it under tension while it's stored, because we don't want to stretch the interior spring mechanism out. So we have set it to 36 foot-pounds. Hope that shows up on the video there. 36, we put the number level with the 30 and then rotate that 6 into position on the foot-pound scale. Then we tighten the big bolt and the small bolt, and that gets it nice and snug. We have affixed our 10mm hex head. It was a 3/8 inch socket. They didn't have a 1/2 inch. We got a new 3/8 to 1/2 inch adapter because mine was broken, and now we can tighten this up to factory specs. Aha! I think that's it. Yep, we're there. 36. Okay, we've picked up a funnel, and we've taken our graduated gallon cylinder and our drain pan, and we're going to pour the amount we collected from the transmission into the gallon jug to see how much we drained out, so we know how much to replace. And we also have to take into account the fact that we definitely lost quite a bit in the overflow and the spillage from the unexpectedly fast rate at which the old fluid came out of the transmission. So I'm going to set this guy up with a tripod so we can pour it in there and see how much we've got. according to the little fill guide I put on the side here, we're just under 3.5 quarts. Now, 3.5 quarts is the rated capacity that was in my Haynes manual for a drain and refill. However, I think it's easy to say we lost, I would say we lost easily a half a quart, maybe even close to a full quart in all the spillage. So we're somewhere between 3.5 and 4 quarts. So if we refilled at least 3.5 quarts up to 4 quarts, I think we're going to be just fine. So we're all done down here. Now we're just going to refill up top. Now, ordinarily, ideally you'll have the vehicle on flat ground before you refill it, but since I know exactly, or a pretty good approximation of how much we took out, I know how much I'm going to put back in, so to avoid running the transmission even long enough to back it off of the ramps, I'm going to go ahead and fill it from up top with the replacement fluid. Then I'll start it up, run it through the gears, and then consider the job done. And I can say that you need to not underestimate the temperature of that fluid. Coming out of there, it is plenty warm, and these gloves were adequate, but I felt the warmth coming through there. Okay, we're going to set the dipstick aside for just a moment. One interesting thing to note, I just got this nice long funnel with the narrow tip for the narrow hole for the dipstick for the transmission. But notice on this little plastic molding, I'm making sure that thing comes off because I darn sure don't want that to go into my transmission when I pour in new fluid. Well, I think we're good to go. I don't see any leaks underneath. So I'm going to go ahead and take it off the parking brake, roll it off of the ramps, check our levels, top it off if we need to, and we're going to be done. It's probably a little hard to see in the camera, but if I'm reading that correctly, we are at the full hot mark, which means that we're right smack in the operating range where we want to be. Well, folks, I think that's about it. We have replaced. We've done a drain and refill on a 2008 Sienna transmission. This is round 1. We're going to do 2 more rounds. I'm going to wait somewhere between, I don't know, 250 and 500 miles. Maybe that might get us actually to next weekend before I repeat this process. Maybe a little longer. I'll continue to do a little reading and find out if there is a prescribed interval between a cyclic change like I'm doing. It was a very simple process. You have to be aware of the higher volume coming out of the transmission pan than you might expect, and it's very hot because it's important to have the transmission warm when it drains, because it drains better, and boy did it come out. We checked our level once we were done. We got it back on relatively level ground. Our driveway is not perfectly level, if you notice that. I'm going to take that into account, so what I'm going to do a little later, I'll put it out on the street and I'll check it one more time. But it looks like we're going to be in good operating range. I'm going to take it for a test run. I don't see any leaks. I did notice one little drop of fresh fluid on the driveway, but that was because I had a little bit of drip coming out of the funnel when I removed it from the dipstick hole. So that's not a leak anywhere near the actual drain plug. So I think this is a complete success. Our transmission should be happier. We're going to do this again in probably 500 or so miles, and we're going to get a minimum of over 50% replacement, with the end goal of having over 70% replaced to keep this transmission happy for hopefully the balance of time we have this vehicle. Unless there's bonus footage for some subsequent reason, let me thank you for watching. I appreciate your interest. We thank you for a few new subscribers that have come along. Please, if you're a DIYer and you like what we do, subscribe, get notifications, put comments in the box, positive or negative. If you're a mechanic and you think I'm an idiot for the way I did what I did, feel free to comment. I'm here to learn and to share what I've learned with others in the hopes of becoming more educated and hopefully saving a few dollars along the way and keeping these expensive cars going for as long as we can, because you know what? I hate paying for cars. That's all for now. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch our video. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a blessed day, everybody. Bye-bye.